Welcome back to Your Story Medicine. Today I am with Constanza Eliana Chinea, who is a Brown Latinx anti-racism educator, producer, and certified yoga instructor with over 10 years of experience in the wellness industry and over 400 years of training in yoga, trauma, and anti-racism. She began teaching and consulting after noticing a need for diversity and representation in the wellness industry. She now teaches yoga teachers and practitioners, as well as wellness entrepreneurs, how to decolonize their practices, create equity for teachers of color, and build inclusive spaces in the community. She's the creator of trainings like Embody, Inclusivity, and Unpacking Spiritual Bypass, and is the host of Decolonizing Yoga and Wellness, which is a web series featuring BIPOC leaders of color who are taking up space in the wellness industry. Hello.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So we were just reflecting on the first time that we connected, which was maybe like 2, 3 years ago. I was still figuring out what the heck I was doing, and you were getting ready to step into this work. And I am just like, oh my God, what would our younger selves think about us? And how far we've come, and how it feels like we're both just sprouting, like we're both just beginning. So grateful to be on this path with you.
Yeah.
With that being said, like, what do you get to celebrate about yourself today?
Oh, today, I feel really blessed today. I'm in good spirits today. I think, I always celebrate when I'm in a good mood because, sometimes it'd be like that. So, yeah, I'm really celebrating that. I'm celebrating, just having a roof over my head and being, in community. That's always a good thing. So, yeah, I'm celebrating life.
And I'm celebrating you and all the amazing work that you're doing. So, if you could take your titles out, how is it that you would describe your medicine?
Yeah, so I would describe it as connection, reclamation, and communal. So there's a lot about my process that is deeply entrenched in relationship and really committed to community, and seeing us thrive. So that's, no titles, that's what it would be.
Wait a minute. I also wanted to celebrate that epic wedding that you just had. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
I need to hear more, probably for another podcast or outside of this. Like, what is it like to decolonize the wedding industrial complex and still participate in it?
Yeah, totally. It's a trip.
Yeah. So, tell us about your ancestral lineage and how is this influencing the ways that you're showing up today?
Yeah, so my background is my ancestry comes from Borinquen, which is the decolonized name, the original indigenous name of Puerto Rico. And my lineage is really steeped in a lot of trauma, a lot of colonization, a lot of, a lot of erasure and genocide. So, all that aside, I come from a really rich culture. I come from a people who are very proud people, very lively, very welcoming people, love music, love to dance, love to celebrate. So, I think that what I really appreciate about my ancestry and just my lineage in itself is that resiliency doesn't look like harsh fighting or strength, even like strength by way of warriorness. It looks like strength by healing from all of those oppressive systems that keep us down and continue to keep us down, keep us colonized, keep us oppressed. Like our music, our culture, our way of being, our way of talking, our way of relating to each other, um, it's all rooted in resiliency. So yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that because lately I've been feeling like the word resilience is a trigger for folks.
Mm-hmm.
I've been seeing a lot of these memes floating around that say, I don't want to be called resilient. I want to be soft. And then I'm like, oh, maybe I'm not supposed to say resilient
Right.
anymore. And yet, resilience doesn't have to look like needing to show up in constant fight, or that like we have to be strong. What if resilience did look like softness?
Mm-hmm.
And I I'm just I'm reflecting on our first interaction with each other, when one of the things that we both had in common is that we were both yoga teachers, and figuring out what our place is in wellness industry, while dreaming about creating more spaces for Black, Indigenous people of color.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, because of the backgrounds that we come from, like both you and I have been involved in organizing, there was this fear of, what if what if my own people don't accept me if I
Mm.
start showing up in this way? Um, and I'm curious, what has been the shift for you?
Mm-hmm.
Well, first of all, like, what do you feel was holding you back from being able to step fully into your medicine?
Mm-hmm.
And what was the shift for you?
Yeah. So, I think at that time, because I was attempting to incorporate more social justice into my work, right? At that point in time, the yoga industry really taught me, like, you have to separate social justice from what we do, right? Like, we don't do that. We don't touch the negative stuff. We only do yoga, which in the West does not mean yoga, right? So that's an aside. But I was really taught that. And so when I was attempting to merge social justice back into wellness, and it wasn't necessarily yoga, but it was just like, let's have a conversation about how the lack of civil rights, or the lack of justice, of racialized justice that we experience, how that informs the way that we practice wellness or attempt to heal. Let's have that conversation, right? And that was radically different than what I was actually seeing in the industry. And so the industry was teaching me one thing, but I was wanting to implement a totally different thing. And so I was on this edge of just constant anxiety. Like, what are white folks going to say? What are people of color going to say? Where am I going to be accepted? Right. And that is the colonized mentality that I was trained to remain in. So even as I'm attempting to talk about social justice, which is a very decolonized type of topic to be, wanting to be discussing, I'm over here in my colonized mind, deathly afraid of what I'm stepping into. So what I've learned throughout that process is, I wasn't afraid of what other people were necessarily going to accept or not accept. I was afraid that by changing my being, the way that I was speaking, the way that I was stepping into rooms, the way that I was approaching certain topics that I was taught not to discuss, that I was somehow leaving behind the only person that I knew how to be, and that I didn't know who I was stepping into. That was the fear. But I was projecting that as, other people aren't going to accept me. So that's what I've learned. I've learned how to really approach not just social justice in a decolonial way, how to approach my entire thinking about how I'm stepping into certain topics, how I'm stepping into my, my social justice activism, how I'm stepping into yoga studios, how I'm stepping into my own reclamation of my ancestral lineage and wisdom, in a very different way. So now the way that I deal with my anxiety and my depression is very different than the way that I dealt with it, 2 years ago, even 6 months ago. Yeah. Did I answer your question?
Yeah. So, what does that look like then? Because we talk about depression, we talk about anxiety, and we often perceive these challenges to be something that's experienced in isolation, when both you and I recognize that these conditions, or whatever you want to call it, is actually a byproduct
Mhm.
of white supremacy, of racism, of these systems of oppression. So, how is it that you cope with your own mental wellness today?
Mm-hmm. It's a combination of things. So, I want to preface this by saying, like, there is so much lack of access to people of color, to medication, to therapy, to wellness, to healing practices, to all sorts of things that we don't ever talk about. And that has a lot to do with class privilege, but it also has a lot to do with racism, right? So the way that I used to deal with it was by self-medicating, right? So I was abusing alcohol to an extreme degree for many, many years. But I didn't have the access to go to rehab. So I had to figure that out, right? Like, I literally had to figure out, how am I going to stop drinking something that I am so addicted to? And it was very social for me. I was a binge alcoholic. How am I going to stop something when I don't even have access to the tools that other people have to be able to stop this with help? And that is a conundrum that so many people of color have to deal with, but in particularly because we live in a society where poverty is the norm. It's more normal, and we're all closer to poverty than we are to wealth. And so that was how I used to deal with it and how I used to manage it. And for many, many years, after sobriety, I was replacing alcohol with other addictions. And that just perpetuated this long cycle of abusing myself, because all I was used to was abuse from the outside world. So, of course, I'm going to abuse myself. Um, and so, when I actually got access to tools like therapy, to tools like medication, then I was really able to take a step back and look at my healing in a totally different way. What does it look like for me not to abuse myself or add to the abuse that society puts on me? What does that look like? And then how do I step outside of a wellness industry that is telling me, just drink, juice every day and you'll be cured, right? Or just practice yoga every day and you'll be fine. Or if you're depressed, that means you're weak minded. So you just need to meditate some more and you'll be good. So, how do I deal with that, right? Which is another form of abuse. It's another form of misunderstanding mental health and mental wellness. Um, so, the way that I have learned to handle a lot of these things is by communication, by relationship, allowing myself to, dive deeper into my traumas rather than trying to bypass my traumas. It's by talking to my therapist and making a commitment to go to therapy. That's another thing people don't talk about. It's one thing to like do one therapy session, it's another thing to come back and to like do it consistently, right? When you don't want to. um it's very difficult when you really, really start to look at your trauma. It's very difficult to want to continue looking at your trauma and have to talk about it over and over and over again and really deal with it in a healthy way. You have to show up for yourself, and that's what I've learned to do. I've learned how to show up for myself in a much bigger way. I've learned how to set boundaries, both with myself and with other people. And that has really flourished, my relationship with my husband. It's flourished other deeper relationships with people who I might have put up walls with in the past, who I was afraid to get close to because they had a certain level of um, holistic wellness about them that I was afraid of, because I didn't, you're by association. I didn't know that by associating myself with healthy people and getting closer to healthy, healing people, that how much that was going to transform me, but I was afraid of it. So I never touched it. So I've learned how to get closer to people who nourish me, who validate me, who affirm me. I've learned how to do that in my own relationship with my partner. And I'm learning how to incorporate that into my activism as well, because in the activist world, it can be very easy to step into ego, individualism. You're holding so much anger and so much energy that you're bringing into your activism, but you don't realize how that's affecting other people as well. And so I'm learning, I'm implementing, and I'm growing every day. So that's become part of my mental healing, my mental wellness, is to have a ton of self-awareness.
Mm. I feel like decolonization has been a word that's popped up a lot more
Mm-hmm.
throughout the years. And it's one thing to talk about it,
Mm-hmm.
it's one thing to read about it, it's a whole another up level to actually embody it. So let's actually break down how is it that you define decolonization and yeah, let's talk about like some of the truths and the myths
Yeah,
behind decolonization.
there's a lot of myths. There's a lot of misconceptions and there's a lot of misinformation. Um, so I define decolonization by way of our old, our the way that it's been defined by previous activists. Decolonization in the dictionary is all physical, right? It's the government removes its government from a space, right? A country, a people. Um, Decolonization, though, goes beyond that, right? So beyond the dictionary term, it actually starts to step into the mindset. So you can't have colonization physically without first having the thought of colonizing. And so that then leads into the actions of colonization, both physically and mentally. So then through that, colonization then turns into systems. So it's not just people colonizing. Now it's an entire structure. It's a system. So now we can work backwards. What does decolonization look like? So it does look physically. So physically, a government can remove itself and leave a people in a country sovereign. But it also looks like the people becoming sovereign mentally on their own, right? So it looks like stepping away from the status quo and starting to look at what are all the ways in which colonization has been internalized by our people, and how can our people, as oppressed and marginalized and othered humans, how can then we start to operate in a different way, in a different capacity? Because I don't know that as a society right now we understand what the opposite of colonization actually looks like, but we do know how to decolonize. People of color know how to decolonize. And so that decolonization takes time, it takes implementation, it takes learning and unlearning. And mostly it takes a lot of self-awareness and a lot of self-critique. That self-critique is the important part as well, as the self-awareness, because a lot of us think I'm decolonizing, but then we're causing harm in other ways that we don't even realize. And, I think earlier we were talking about lateral violence too, right? Lateral violence is a form of colonization. It's a form of power dynamic. And that power dynamic was taught to us by way of colonization. And colonization has existed for centuries, way before America was colonized. It was happening in Europe. It was happening in the continent of Asia. It was happening in the continent of Africa. Like, it was happening way before America became a thing. And so that mentality continues in us. And so we have to work really, really hard at that self-critique and that self-analysis in order to really learn what does decolonization actually look like, and then moving beyond decolonization, because a lot of people think decolonization is the be-all end-all. It's not. There are things beyond decolonization that are actually much more important than decolonization, but we just don't know how to get there yet because we're still so focused on oppression. So we don't even know what it looks like once we're not oppressed. What's that world going to look like? What's the work after that? So I think that's how I would define it, and that's how a lot of philosophers, decolonial philosophers, would define it, and it's how our ancestors would define it.
Yeah. So what is beyond it?
Yeah, that's the question, right? So beyond it, it's reindigenizing, it's wisdom. Decolonization is not the be all end all because it's still focused on the colonial part. So when we choose to move, and it at this point, for white folks, it is a choice to continue colonizing, right? It is not a choice for people of color, but it is a choice for white folks and whiteness and the status quo to continue to colonize. So once society decides, you know what, we want to operate in a different way, we want to operate in a way that is more decolonized, and we can talk about maybe later the terms of unsettling versus decolonization, which it needs to be distinct. Then, you know, it's the role of people of color is that decolonial aspect of the mindset. And then once we get to that edge of getting away from colonization and moving beyond decolonization, that's the sweet spot where we can then really start to create new structures of being, new structures of operating socially, new structures of operating globally. And then once we move beyond that, then there's the new structures of operating with the earth, new structures with operating with nature. And that is the indigenous wisdom that we used to have that we no longer have. So that's what there's many, many levels to it. But everyone's so focused on decolonization right now because it's so in your face. Like colonization and oppression, it's so in your face, it's so traumatic, it's so fiercely impactful that's the first thing that we see. And so that's the first thing that we have to deal with. But beyond that, there are other things that we need to deal with as well. But that's, you know, later.
Yeah, but how is it that we can even re-indigenize when so many people have no idea what their indigenous roots are?
Well, you don't need to know what your indigenous roots are to re-indigenize. And that's the part that I want people of color to really, really understand, because that's what I've learned. I've learned that I don't need a piece of paper to tell me, you know, these are your indigenous ancestors from, you know, 1100, because what I do know is that the indigenous wisdom still exists in humans. The fact that we've been colonized does not mean that that our indigenous wisdom was completely erased. It just means that we've been oppressed and suppressed. But suppression actually means that something is being pushed down, not that it's disappeared. Genocide is a totally different thing. But oppression and suppression means that there's still wisdom there, but it's being suppressed by this other bigger power. So you don't actually need to know the names of your ancestors to have relationship with your ancestors. You don't need to know the tribe of your ancestors to have deep wisdom of what their spiritual practices were, because it gets passed down through us, through our bones, through our cells, through our DNA. And that is a fact that has been proven by science. Not that we need it to be, but it's a fact, right? Things get passed down. And so it's here, but we're dealing with so many power structures that it makes us think by design that, oh, that indigenous wisdom, it's gone, it's a thing of the past. It's not. And so that's the beyond decolonization that I'm talking about. It's re-indigenizing our frame of thought, our frame of being, our structures, so that we can go back to that wisdom rather than thinking that wisdom is totally gone and now I have to, you know, it's almost like a mechanism of self-repression rather than empowerment.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean you need to travel back to your motherland. You need to learn the rituals and wear the clothes, because I know that for many people who have been far removed from their ancestral roots, there's also this concern of not wanting to appropriate their own ancestors' traditions.
Mm-hmm.
But what does any of the ritual or the clothing or the mantras or the prayer matter if it is not actively being like for me, the ultimate form of decolonization comes down to love. And I know that that can sound super spiritual bypassy, but I see it as like, wow, our ancestors, at least my belief, is that we operated more from the heart than from the mind. We led with the body. And we're trying to intellectualize our way out of oppression versus versus looking at the relationship we have with the people around us, as well as the relationship that we have with ourselves, the voices that may have told us that you can't do this, you can't be a certain way, you can't take up space.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it's like so much of the work that I do is all about embodying these ancestors, embodying these future ancestors, which really can be a part of that remembrance. That to me is what reindigenizing means.
Mm. Yeah, I think there's definitely elements of that for sure. And I totally believe that. And I don't think it sounds weird to say, love in these streets. Like I'm all here for it. I also think, and I would add that when we're talking about, you mentioned ritual, you mentioned, not wanting to appropriate traditions and things like that, right? That is absolutely true. Like you want to have respect for ancestral spiritual practices, but also understanding that those traditions and those spiritual practices are on a physical level. They are meant to keep you in connection with spirit and, the divine, or whatever language you want to use, right? Um, but they're still a physical thing. It's like you said, the intellectualization of everything. There's an element of it that is very important. We would want to have, critical analysis. We want to make sure that we're not disrespecting. And also, if we're talking about spirituality, that's not a physical thing. You can't touch spirituality. You can't touch the divine. You can feel it, you can sense it, you can move with it, you can move beyond it, you can dance with it, you can, create music through it. Like it's not a physical thing. And so is ancestry, right? Ancestral lineage is not physical. It lives within you, but there is we have to move beyond the physical. So that re-indigenizing is going back to wisdom, not a physical tradition, um, because you're not going to be able to touch it, but you are going to be able to feel it, and through that feeling you're going to be able to move beyond it. Uh-oh, did I lose you? Oh. I had finished my thought and it recorded everything. So
Oh, I paused the recording.
I think when you're at Thing Crash, it made me host. And so it just kept recording. So I paused
Oh,
it. Yeah, I paused it when you were gone.
hey. Okay. Editor, erase this part out. Okay, we're gonna keep continuing. Okay, hold on. So let's explore the difference then between decolonizing and unsettling, because I think it's important that we do acknowledge that we could talk about decolonization and yet we are all settlers on stolen and occupied land. So how is it that we do our own work with where it is we're currently at?
Yeah, so this is one of the, earlier you asked the question of like, what are some of the myths of decolonization and all of that. So I think one thing that has gotten lost in this conversation of decolonization and it becoming a buzzword, and now it's everywhere, it's in marketing, it's in, names of podcasts, even like everything, right? So the most important thing to understand is that decolonization as a theory, as a philosophy, and as a concept was always for people of color. It was always for the oppressed. It was always for the marginalized. Meaning that, scholars, for instance, like Frantz Fanon, he was big on decolonization is specific to people of color, understanding that they even are colonized, and then moving beyond that as a mentality, as an internalized way of being. So the activists before us, they made the distinction of decolonization versus unsettling. So unsettling is really and truly the work of white folks, because currently, as it stands, white supremacy is the dominant culture. That's what is oppressing literally everybody else underneath them. And so through the structure of racism that they created, unsettling is actually their role. So decolonization is for people of color, unsettling is the role of white folks. And so when we're talking about physical, then yes, all of us are settler colonials on a land that was stolen, et cetera, right? Like we know that intellectually. However, mindset wise, the structure is as such that even if people of color are given a little bit more access to things, a little bit more money, a little bit more power, it's still not the level of power that whiteness has. Whiteness still holds all of the privilege. It still is the status quo. It still is the validation. It still sets the standard. It's still everything above everybody else. And so when we're talking about unsettling, in terms of the ideology of decolonization, that's the work for whiteness. And a lot of people get those two like totally mixed up, confused. Like some people have never even heard the word unsettling before. And so when I do my workshops around decolonial philosophy and theory, I always tell people, based on your lived identity, this is going to look very different. For the oppressed and the marginalized and people of color, decolonization is what it's going to look like. For white folks and people who hold whiteness as their lived experience, unsettling is going to be your work. And so they work in tandem and they need to work separately but together, meaning people of color need to do their work over here, whiteness needs to do its work over here, but as we do it in tandem, eventually we're going to meet together and we're going to do work together. And it needs to be that way, because no, people of color are not going to dismantle white supremacy. Only whiteness can do that. But whiteness can't decolonize something that they actually created through a colonial mindset. Only people of color can do that. If you've ever read the book Pedagogy of the Oppressed, this is the entire book is that. Pedagogy of the Oppressed is basically Paulo Freire going through the process of helping you as the reader understand, in parts 1 through 2, helping you as a reader understand the structure of oppression, both by created by the oppressed and how that operates, but also how it is impacted and lived through the oppressed. So how oppression works in both ways, how it works separately and how it works in tandem together. And so he is very adamant that oppression is not going to go away by the creator of oppression. It's only going to be dismantled through the oppressed. But the oppressor also has to do its work so that in tandem, we can dismantle oppression together through the lead of the oppressed. Am I getting too heady here?
No, I mean,
Okay.
hey, this is like my language. I don't talk so much about it publicly, but I'm glad you do.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for people to discern that when we talk about dismantling white supremacy, it does not mean dismantling white people.
Right. Well, there's an element to dismantle that white people dismantle whiteness within themselves. But what we're not saying is we're canceling white people. That's not possible, right? Like we can't do that. You exist. We acknowledge your full humanity.
Yeah.
However, there are lots of things you need to dismantle over here, on your own, doing your own unlearning, relearning, whatever. And then there's the work of people of color that needs to be left alone, right? I think whiteness loves to insert itself in the work of people of color. Like they love to be inserted in there. It's kind of like that whole thing that we keep hearing about the cookout, right? Like white people love to be invited to the cookout, but then they don't know how to act in the cookout, right? And then after they leave the cookout, what are they doing? They're fucking shit up. So it's kind of like that. Like we all need to understand what our roles are based on our lived experiences. My lived experience is not the same as your lived experience. It's not the same as somebody who holds Blackness as their lived experience. Yeah. So I need to do my work over here. Other people with other identities need to do their work over here based on their cultural understanding and identities. But we come together to do the decolonial work together. And then white folks are over here doing their dismantling, their work at the same time, so that when we're ready to dismantle some shit together, we've already done the work individually to be able to dismantle the bigger system. So
Mhm.
I really want people to understand that, because capitalism is always going to stress that, like, learn decolonization in 2 hours. Not possible, by the way.
Yeah.
Absolutely not possible. Or decolonize, Reiki, or decolonize this or decolonize that, right? Like, here's your training for, here's your 10-hour certification for this, that, and the other, right? That's what the Western world loves to do. We
Yeah.
eat it up, right? We're like, yes, give me all the certifications and all the things that I can
Yeah.
add to the list, right? But that is an internalized capitalistic colonial way of operating. So it's almost like snake oil. People love to sell snake oil as like, this is going to cure your cancer, this is going to cure this is going to cure that, without having the understanding of, like, that's not really how that works, and there's all of these other things that you need to do before you even get to that point where we can even have the
Yeah.
conversation about doing these things, right? So there's so much work to be done. It takes a level of commitment, implementation, understanding, unlearning, relearning. Like, it's a lifetime of work.
It is a lifetime. The most viral post I ever made was the quickest reel I recorded, which was only like 5 seconds long with like no editing. And all I said was, let white supremacy dismantle itself. I had a lot of people who were upset and a lot of people who were so relieved
Mm-hmm.
that the burden didn't need to be placed on them,
Right.
especially BIPOC folks. Like, we have our own work to do. And like, it is safe for you to be in your joy and center your wellness and your
Yeah.
pleasure as well. So, what is one step that people can take now to start their own decolonizing journey?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I have one more question for you after that.
Okay. Yeah. So, one step, I mean, I can only ever speak from my own experience. I think the first step that I took was acknowledging that I wasn't operating as my fullest self. And I think we were just talking about this earlier too, is, you know, I did a lot of pretending when I was younger. So, my lived experience was being raised on the island in Puerto Rico with my family, and then moving to the United States when I was about 8 years old. And so, what that does to a child is it makes you assimilate into a culture that you don't fully understand and doesn't fully understand you, and it doesn't even want to embrace you as its own. So there's a lot of trauma that comes with that. There's a lot of jumping back and forth, right? Like, for at least for me, it was one moment I was embracing my Puerto Rican culture, and the other moment I was totally dismissing it. I wanted to be 100% American, whatever that meant. And so there was a lot of, double Dutch. I used to play double Dutch when I was little. So there was a lot of like, okay, I'm here, now I'm here, now I'm here, now I'm here. And so I was doing a lot of pretending. And it wasn't until I left college, actually, in my later 20s, that I realized, you know what? I am not being my fullest self. I don't even know what my fullest self looks like, but I'm recognizing that I'm pretending. And that was the first step, honestly. That really and truly was the first step to getting me to think outside of the normal conditioning that I was trained to have. And so once I was able to get out of that little matrix, then I was able to be like, okay, well, what does my fullest self actually look like? And why do I feel like I haven't been operating as my fullest self? Well, it's because of these things, and because you were taken away from your culture, and because white folks, bullied you when you were little, and you were always, the weird foreign girl, and you internalized that as this, etc. So just kind of going through your life story and realizing all the ways in which you have been pretending, so that you can soothe that little part of you that feels suppressed. And then once you acknowledge that, then it starts to come to the surface, and you're like, oh, here I am. I don't have to pretend anymore. I can now start to work out of this costume that I've been building up all my life. And now I can start to operate in a totally different way. And that's a beautiful thing.
Yes, actually, that's the perfect segue into my last question, which is my favorite. So, if you can envision yourself as a future ancestor
Mm.
and speak to that version of yourself that felt split and didn't feel like they could fully be themselves, what is it that you would say?
So I love that question. And I don't have to imagine it because I'm actively working through that every single day.
Yes.
So what informs my work and my activism is that it's the future. I want to see a future. And even if I don't see it personally, like physically in this lifetime, I want to see a future where little brown girls just like myself, little black girls just like myself, little black boys and brown boys, and all of these identities that we have the language for, they don't have to put on that costume. And so the work and the activism that I'm currently doing, I feel, and other people can disagree, but I feel like that is my little brick that I'm placing on this path of humanity. So that is my little piece to humanity and to society to say, hey, I was here and I tried to do better. And I really worked hard at it. And I really, really tried to dismantle some shit and fuck shit up. So that
Yes.
you could then try to dismantle other shit without having to dismantle the shit that I had to dismantle, right? And then we can really get somewhere. So that's what informs my work. I have had so many moments where I've been like, I'm gonna quit. This is too hard. This is too challenging. People don't understand me. This will never change. I have gone into every disparaging thought that a human could possibly fall into. And the thing that always brings me back is, what about them? What about the future? What about the people that are going to come after you? Don't they deserve more? And so I don't have to imagine it. I'm already doing it.
Yes, I love it. I love it. Yes, imagination and also bringing it into this physical realm because we're all ancestors
Yep.
in the comeback as well as in the making. Thank you so much, Eliana, for joining us today. And where's it that people can go and learn more about what you're doing and your offerings to continue their own decolonization journey?
Yes. So I'm mostly on Instagram and Patreon. So people can find me on Instagram at eliana.chinea. And on Patreon, it's patreon.com/Constanza Eliana. And I'm sure you'll have the spelling somewhere.
Yeah, check out the show notes.
There you go. And then also on my website, embodyinclusivity.com. That's where you can find all of my courses, both in person, which are going to start happening next year, and also digital, all of my digital courses that are either pre-recorded or live. So yeah, I hope to see some people there.
Yes. So stay engaged in Eliana's work. And every time I see your content, I'm like, oh, there she goes again, fucking shit up, getting us
Yeah,
upset, and also just so hyped about what's possible. So
yeah.
thank you. I'm so honored to walk this path with you. And man, our elder granny selves are going to look back on all the work we're doing today and be like, dang, I'm so
Mhm.
proud. I'm so proud of us. And then we still have to have our salsa date,
Yes,
right?
absolutely. Let's
Yes,
do
I'll make
it.
it happen. All right. Mwah.
Thank you.